President Obama reversed several decisions of President Bush, and so he made it possible for Cuban Americans to visit their families whenever they want and to send money, remittances, to their families in Cuba. I think the Obama administration has taken baby steps on a long journey. The problem is it still considers Cuba to be a threat to the United States.
The world came ever so close to real nuclear war more than 50 years ago. There were plans to invade a small island and perhaps even drop a nuke on it. And it resonates to this day in the chance we might actually soon have normal relations with that tiny yet strategically critical island of Cuba. Welcome to MidPoint, professor of government at American University and co-author of the new book, Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations and Havana. William LeoGrande joins us. Bill, thanks so much for being here.
Glad to be with you.
I think that people would be rather shocked to find out that we have actually had consistent back-channel discussions with the Cuban government since 1959. We've never really gone away from talking to them, though, have we?
No, we really haven't. Even President Eisenhower, who was the first president to have to deal with Fidel Castro, had negotiations in the hopes that it might be possible to prevent the breakdown in relations. And then every president since then has talked to Cuba about one issue or another. Even conservative Republicans like Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and both George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush.
All right, now, here's for the uninitiated, because there's so many of us in the audience who remember the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, at least reading about it, hearing more about it, watching a lot of the history here, and even some pretty bad movies at times. But for those who may not be aware, all they're going to say to, and I've had somebody say this to me, Bill, wait a minute, it's an island. It's a little tiny island. It doesn't have much. So the missiles were there once. It's not a big deal. Why do we care so much about Cuba?
Well, it's not a big security threat anymore since the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union disappeared. That was our principal concern during the Cold War from a security point of view, was Cuba's strategic partnership with the Soviet Union. Once that went away, Cuba's importance really did diminish considerably. But of course, the Cuban American community in South Florida for many years was important politically in the critical state of Florida and absolutely adamantly opposed to any kind of improvement in U.S.-Cuban relations, and they had disproportionate political power as a result.
Why then, though, if it still is, and you're right, politically, socially, economically, there's a lot of things here. Why then are we still at the point where no matter what happens, and even though we have back-channel negotiations, we can't seem to just get through that last line of defense and make them just a little bit closer and maybe try to settle some of this? What's the big block here?
Well, I think right now, the big block actually is the fact that the embargo against Cuba, the U.S. economic embargo, is written into law. It was written into law in 1996, and so for the president to lift it, he has to get an act of Congress. And of course, the president's had some problems with Republicans in Congress getting a whole variety of pieces of legislation through. Nevertheless, if the president wanted to, he could use his executive authority in this area, just like he's talked about using it in other areas like immigration, to make some real progress in relations with Cuba.
Now, this is interesting because the Panamanian foreign minister has invited the Cuban president, Raul Castro, to the Summit of the Americas. The nation's hosting that in April. America had blocked Cuba's invitation to the previous 6 events, but now they're going to go. Well, how does this then work into the whole discourse here, and what kind of a slap was this at America, if it was at all, because the Americans just simply did not want the Castro government there?
That's right. And in fact, the United States blocked Cuba's participation in the previous summits. But Latin America just got fed up with that, and the Latin American heads of state at the previous summit in Cartagena, Colombia, warned President Obama that if the Cubans were not invited to this coming summit, then Latin America would boycott it. So I think the administration wisely decided that our relations with the whole hemisphere were important enough that we should go to the summit even though the Cubans are likely to be there. But this actually presents President Obama with an opportunity. He's been saying since he was elected that Cuba policy doesn't make sense, it hasn't worked for 50 years, and we need to try something new. This will be the first time when he sits across the table from Raul Castro in a diplomatic meeting, and he'll have an opportunity to talk about something new.
Is there any chance whatsoever, and again, I've heard this too from friends of mine in South Florida, any chance whatsoever that Cuba may once again, it still is a communist nation, come into any kind of an alliance with Vladimir Putin, who certainly is looking to spread his Cold War wings these days, and any chance that something might come back in again, we might have Russia sitting 90 miles to the south?
I don't think so. Cuba's interest in repairing its relationship with Russia is really a commercial one. The Cubans are looking for trade credits from Russia, and Putin has been willing to provide some of those. But I think the Cubans are wise enough to know that a military strategic alliance with Russia at this point doesn't make a lot of sense for them.
Was Henry Kissinger really serious, and in your book you talk about this, that he was so angry that he wanted contingency plans and was ready to attack Cuba, maybe even drop a bomb on them, or was that just hyperbole at the time?
No, I think he was very serious. When the Cubans sent troops into Angola, despite the fact that Kissinger had offered to normalize relations with them in secret diplomacy, he was just livid. And he, in the Oval Office, he said to President Gerald Ford, I think we're going to need to clobber the Cubans, but we may have to wait until after the election. And President Ford said, I agree. Well, of course, President Ford lost the election to Jimmy Carter, so they never had a chance to carry through with those plans.
How active are these back-channel communications today, as you and I sit here right now?
Well, of course, we don't know for sure because, as they've always been, these communications are highly secret and kept very closely held by senior government officials. I think it's likely that we're having some discussions with the Cubans, at least through our diplomatic missions. We've had low-level discussions for the last few years, and there seems to be an indication today that the Obama administration would like to find a way to move ahead with Cuba, and that ultimately is going to mean having to deal with the problem of Alan Gross, the USAID contractor who's imprisoned in Havana, and the Cuban spies of the Cuban Five who are still imprisoned in the United States.
Only got about 15 seconds left. Any chance that the Cubans, we just wait until the current presidency dies out and there's going to be a new regime there, something younger, something more democratic?
No, I don't think that'll make a lot of difference. I think Cuba is on an evolutionary path. It's changing economically a lot. But ultimately, the same national interests that we have right now in normalizing relations with Cuba will still be there when Raul Castro is gone.
All right. The book, again, is Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana, now in hardcover. Fascinating read indeed. Professor William LeoGrande. Bill, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Next up, the bare-chested dictator, heading back to the Cold War. That's coming up right here on MidPoint.